Everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. We recognize that this session is positioned very uncomfortably before lunchtime. So if you are having lunch, bon appetit at your screens, sitting comfortably in your homes. Let's kick off. And it's interesting to be situated in a culture session. Of course, climate change can be defined under culture, but it can mainly be defined under everything. It's such a holistic concept that surrounds our lives, whether we like it or not. And we all have to take a massive part in it. Not in the climate change itself, of course. We've done that already and led ourselves to this situation that we're in today. What I meant is, of course, in resolving it, in mitigating the damage that we've already done, in adapting to the parts of the damage that are no longer avoidable, so we can all continue living prosperous lives, and in salvaging some of the ruins that are already gone. I think my presentation is up on screen. I hope it is. I'm going to run through it, and I'm going to talk about three major things. But before I start, I want to remind us where we are. We're in the hottest summer ever since we started taking records. We've seen 38 degrees centigrade in the Arctic Circle, in Siberia burning. A third of Bangladesh is underwater. There are hurricanes landing everywhere, and North America has been hit hard. The Caribbean is being hit hard. These are kind of daily headlines that we are constantly being bombarded with. Who remembers that Australia was burning with wildfires a few months ago? Who remembers wildfires in California, in Orange, San Francisco? That's just like 2-3 weeks ago. All of these are constantly here. And it's like watching an apocalypse in slow motion. It's the first time that we are really seeing something that we knew was coming. It isn't something like out of a zombie movie or an apocalypse movie where a meteor hits the earth and there's like 1 minute of change. We are now seeing this in slow motion. Things that we said that were coming are now coming, and we can see them on a daily basis. Are they related to climate change and to human-made climate change? Absolutely. We're observing the first anthropogenic, which is caused by humans, changes to our climate. And we can now say with a very high degree of certainty that this is indeed due to human activities, from rising sea levels to extreme weather events to the ones that we already saw. Both hurricanes and heat waves. I think the last heat wave, last summer, I think there were 70,000 deaths in Europe only due to the heat wave. Water shortages, and other horrific things that we're going through. Wildfires, of course. Now, while we sit comfortably in our homes, connected to Wi-Fi, and watching our screens, we need to remember, of course, that climate change does not hit everyone equally. The ones who always are hit hardest are also hit hardest by climate change. So it's the poorest in our own communities, the ones who can't pay their energy bills, the ones who will suffer when the flood comes because they cannot afford insurance. In our communities, in the UK, in our communities, in our cities, in our towns, and of course around the world, the countries that are the poorest, the countries that have always been hit hardest and been subject to exploitation of richer countries who were, showing up, taking up minerals and slaves and whatever. Those are the same countries that are today hit hardest by climate change, although they are the ones who contributed the least to creating it. So with that in memory, we have three real questions. It's really bad. It's getting worse. It's really hard to ignore the fact that it's getting worse. What have we done about climate change so far? And can we actually get to a place where we get back into the safe zone? Why should we act on it? I mean, we're in a project managers conference, right? We all work for organizations. Most of our organizations are there to make money and to pay us salaries at the end of the month or at the end of the week. We are very clear that we cannot operate unless something is financially sustainable and not just nice tree huggy conceptual sustainable. Can we actually do it? Is there a business case for acting on climate change? And finally, this is all very nice. Climate change is important. We all recognize that. Some of our kids went on marches. Maybe we went on marches as well. But we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Can we actually deal with climate change now when we have a pandemic to deal with? And what I will say, and I'm not going to have a section on COVID and climate change, I'm going to weave COVID into this presentation in general, is that if we think about it, COVID is a cautionary tale for climate change. COVID shows us what happens when we do not plan, when we do not think systematically, when we ignore science, when we constantly put short-term interests ahead of long-term sustainabilities, when people who were screaming about pandemics for years and put down reports and did risk assessments and said, here's what it's going to look like if a virus pops up. And, everything was written and everything's on the government's desk. But if you ignore that, here's what happens a few years later. COVID, of course, is one of those that hits the poorest and the most vulnerable harder than anyone else. The ones who have to work in high-risk jobs, the one who couldn't afford staying at home, the ones who lived in dense population circumstances and multi-generational homes, the ones who could only take public transportation to work, the ones who work in the fields. There are many similarities between those. The silver lining around that, of course, is that solving climate change and solving COVID are things that are both rooted in systematic thinking and systems thinking, and using now the climate crisis in order to solve COVID, using COVID opportunities that come from COVID in order to inject more into fighting climate change are these opportunities present themselves very, very clearly. To be really clear, no one in the climate change community thinks that COVID is a good thing, for example, because flights stopped and now emissions dropped. No one has ever said that, and no one thinks that. The emissions drop that resulted from the temporary lowering of human activities during COVID was a minor dent in the major emissions reduction that we need to do. And moreover, it again feeds into those inequalities and into those disasters and actually exacerbates climate change vulnerabilities for many. The only thing that we say is let's take the opportunity to recover from COVID to also do that in a way that is compatible with the climate crisis that we need to solve. So what have we done about climate change so far? We've been at it for a while now. We've been at climate change for about 30 years. In 2015, we as the world managed to do something remarkable. For the first time, we had a unanimous consensus on the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a 2-degree and preferably below level. 2 degrees means 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is when we started burning fossil fuels and injecting greenhouse gas emissions much more rapidly into our atmosphere. 2 degrees seemed like a safe space. However, 3 years later, before that, as part of the Paris Agreement, every single country has committed to emissions reductions, has committed to policy action, and so that is happening. Many countries, so all the countries have some form of climate legislation on their books and in their policy books, and that is all happening. There's more than 2,000 laws and policies today on governments' law books dealing with climate change. But then came 2018, and in 2018, the Scientific Advisory Board, which is made up of hundreds of scientists, it's called the IPCC, released a new report, and it says 2 degrees is not enough. 2 degrees is not enough. We need to be at 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It sounds like a minor difference. What's a half a degree? But if you think of your own body temperature and think what happens to your body temperature when it's half a degree up, those are major changes. And on a planetary level, they are incredible changes. There's an anecdote that I repeat, so apologies for any of you who've ever heard this before. But but just to demonstrate the difference, limiting global temperatures to 2 degrees is not a great thing. It just means that we're stopping short of a disaster. At 2 degrees, 80% of the world's coral reefs are gone. That's what happens at 2 degrees, with, of course, all the effects that it has on marine life, on marine biodiversity, on the ability to capture CO2, which happens, of course, by marine vegetation and so on. In 1.5 degrees, in 1.5 degrees, 80% are gone. In 2 degrees, 100% of them are gone. The ability to understand the scale of this change is just unbelievable. Now, we're coming up to 5 years from Paris, and next month we were supposed to have the next climate summit in Glasgow. Due to COVID, that's been delayed in about in a year, so that's going to be next November in Glasgow. And in that time, what's going to happen is every single government that submitted their nationally determined contributions, so their commitments to the Paris Agreement, is going to increase their commitments. That's a kind of a built-in mechanism, which is a really interesting mechanism that I think can and should be applied on an organizational level. You commit to something, but then you have a review period and you increase your ambition. You set your targets higher. So the Paris Agreement had that built in, and all governments in the world now have to submit their upgraded plans. When submitting upgraded plans, of course, this means that this trickles down. It trickles down with policy decisions, it trickles down with regulation, and it mainly trickles down to all of us, not as individuals, but as organizations, or let's say both, who need our collective action, both in our companies and our projects, and of course in our individual lives, to rise up to those increased ambitions. One important sentence about individuals: it's really easy to talk about the behavioral changes that we need to take: drive less, fly less, change your car to an electric car, take a train instead of a plane, close the lights, change your heating system from gas to a heat pump or to hydrogen. All of that is great. The most fortunate of us maybe are able to afford it. Maybe. Most of us cannot afford it without substantive investment. And mainly, most of us can't afford it or can't even take it forward without infrastructure that will allow us to have it. If the roads aren't paved with charging stations for electric vehicles, then even if you own an electric vehicle, there's no point because you can't even charge it anywhere. So there's a really important feedback loop between collective action or policy action and between individual behavior. And always remember that putting the burden on individuals is a way of getting, shifting responsibility from where the main action has to happen, which is around policy and around big organizational change. What's important, of course, to note is that current commitments still give us about 3 degrees in warming, and hopefully increased ambition will take us closer to 2 or to 1.5 degrees. This graph was released last week by the International Energy Agency, and it shows us where we are. So the stated policy scenarios is the aggregation of all the current commitments. You can see that it takes us far beyond where we need to go. The sustainable development scenario is about 2 degrees, and you can see that in order to get to what we call net zero by 2050 is what will take us to a 1.5 degree kind of scenario, but we're not really sure about that. There's only a 50% chance that it will. So for a 50% chance to be in kind of the safe zone, this is how quickly we have to act, and you can see how what a difference there is between the stated policy, so where we are now, and what we need to do in terms of emissions. So net zero is possible, and of course it's more difficult to do in certain sectors. And we'll run super quickly through some of these sectors, what needs to be done, what are the main opportunities, and then let's see if that's actually worth it. So obviously electric power is one of the great things that happen. More renewables, phasing out coal, which Britain committed to, phasing out coal completely by 2025 as a source of electricity. Already now, we dropped from 60% coal, which was kind of the bread and butter of British electricity, all the way down to a single digit, including 2 months clean, no coal phase when only renewables and gas played into that just recently. So we're almost rid of coal, but not quite there yet. Of course, we need to address storage. So renewables produce energy when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing. What happens when they're not? How do you store the electricity that was produced at that time and use it a little later? So costs of storage still need to drop for us to be able to do that effectively. And CCS there is carbon capture and storage, and how do you take the carbon from the atmosphere and store it back safely? Using coal mines, by the way, is one of the tricks for that. Condensing that carbon and storing it in old mines is one of the things that is talked about. Surface transport, so switching to electric vehicles, better logistics, energy efficiency, and of course managing that through our all of our value chains in our organizations. Buildings, both smart energy efficiency, heat pumps, is extremely important in Britain, where you need to heat homes and organizations. And hydrogen is one of the things that's being talked about and developed. I think Britain has admitted, I don't know if admitted it out loud, but admitted that it's probably not going to be one of the winners of the renewable race. There are other players that are snatching up the renewable economy in terms of production. But hydrogen is still one of those massive opportunities for Britain to be a leader on, to create tons of jobs and so on. With industry, of course, looking at your energy, at your resource efficiency, thinking about a circular economy, which means that you don't do production use waste, but you think about how waste from one process serves as a resource for another process, and of course making sure there is as little waste as possible in the process, and so on. And again, using clean technology in industry. Agriculture, a critical one, both in terms of personal choices and the systemic incentives that can lead to them. It is inevitable to talk about dietary choices where meat and dairy are very, very high up on the high emission foods, but also land use maintenance practices are critical to that because of chemicals that are involved in the process of that, and so on. And of course, tree growing, always important to remember that planting a seed or supporting a little sapling is definitely not enough. A tree will contribute to negative emissions, so using CO2 from the atmosphere only at a much later stage of its life. So making sure that planting is a part of a large program to see that tree to its full size, and so on. Aviation, a critical one. Who doesn't want to be on a plane right now to a warm destination? We all do. However, aviation is or has been climbing rapidly, and after COVID, there's no reason to believe why some of it at least won't be back to its normal levels, like many other things have gone back up to their normal levels. So looking at how we can do aviation better, from fuel efficiency, which is a matter of airplane design and pilot choices, to constrained demand, of course, but also to electric engines for short-haul flights and biofuels for long-haul flights. So these are some of the ways that we can get to net zero, but should we? Can we get to net zero and actually be financially sustainable? And Mark Carney, who's the outgoing chair, sorry, I'm blanking. Mark Carney from the Bank of England, who's the UN Special Envoy and on green finance has stated time and again that this is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time, that investing in net zero projects is probably going to be one of the more efficient things that an organization can do. So what does that look like? So on the short term, we can kickstart a sluggish economy. We can kickstart a post-COVID economy with investment in green jobs. We can overcome market failures that hold back productivity by using resources in a different way. We can make sure that the net zero investments hold us back, that stop things that hold us back, like pollution, because obviously the net zero solutions will also reduce air pollution. Air pollution is the stuff that we breathe into our lungs and is bad for us. CO2 is okay for our lungs. We breathe it in and out, and that's no problem. But the emissions from transportation, for example, the nitrogen oxides, is what matches. It's both a greenhouse gas, so contributes to to global warming and to climate change, but also really bad for our health. And of course, long-term rechanging models, rethinking business models will contribute to what we call a creative destruction. How do we take down a system that really hasn't been working for us? And it hasn't been working for us because we're bringing ourselves to the brink of extinction. That's not a system that works for us. Maybe it works for us. It definitely will not work for our children. So rethinking these processes is something that in the long term, we're there. So the UK government has been talking about that, talking about being the home of electric vehicles and hydrogen and all of that. I think the press release you can see on the bottom right side, talking about new and green jobs and so on. I think they kind of missed the investment part that is important for that. But there's still much more to do in terms of British policy on this. But apart from policy, we see really interesting actors start to weigh in on this. On the left-hand side, we can see Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. I really think that the editor should have swapped the title. I think with the first line of this story, "God is moving into the index business," I think would have been a much better title. And the Church of England has just invested £600 million in a climate index. That climate index is informed by a really data-heavy management tool, which, to be completely transparent about, is done at the LSE, and I am part of. And what we do there is we look at the 400 highest emitting companies in the world, and we rank them based on their climate practices, on their governance, on how much they care about climate change. Do they have a board member that takes, do they have board responsibility for climate change? Have they set targets? Do they have their emissions verified? And a whole host of questions. And also, what are their actual emissions against the relevant benchmarks? This data tool was is taken so seriously by investors that investors with 21 trillion combined assets under management are now using it to make decisions because they view it as a really, really critical prism through which they look at companies and at their prospective success. This goes on to talk about zero carbon as a risk story. Risk is the main prism that we should be looking through when we think about climate change. What is our chance to pull it off? If we don't, to pull it off in general, in life, in financial sustainability, if we do not take carbon into consideration. So we can see that there's really interesting things to think about risk. For example, if you today are invested in a coal plant, then you're just not profitable. And one of the risks when you run a high emissions business is that low emissions or green technologies will outperform you. The drop in prices of renewable energies has been so remarkable that today there is absolutely no reason to invest financially in those dirty projects unless you have this massive subsidy from the government, which favors that. But from a purely economic point of view, renewables are now overcoming that. And here's our example with the kind of Nextera, which is the largest producer of wind technology, has just surpassed ExxonMobil in market cap. You know, this tremendous monster, which is Exxon, which ever since the 80s knew exactly in internally documented models that its emissions from its products is going to cause climate change. So all of that has been carefully documented. I know that we're really close to the time, so I'm gonna zoom quickly through that just to say that there's a wave of climate change liability lawsuits against high emitting companies, and that's also something to look out for. And that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions.